Okay, 3 odds and ends. Clarification about these vocab items, clarification about reference data types and null, and a quick note about overloaded constructors. So this problem set is going to test your understanding of how these words are different. A class is just a definition for a new type of object. People use the words object and instance as rough synonyms. An object is an instance of a class, but an instance is just a specific realization of a particular class definition. So, for example, if you had a dog class that defines a new type of object called dog, running the constructor would create an instance of the dog class. An instance would be a specific example of that definition where the variables that define dog have been given specific values. Attributes are the variables within a class that define the facts about that class. So, for example, here's a car class. Color, model, and year are all facts about particular cars. So these would be attributes. If I run the car constructor, that creates an instance of the car class. You could also say it creates a car object. That's the same thing. That instance gets saved inside the myCar variable. The myCar variable is data type car. You could say it contains an object. You could say it contains an instance of the car class. Again, same thing. Okay, so let's talk about reference data types and null. Any data type that starts with a lowercase letter is primitive. So lowercase int, double, boolean, float. Those are all primitive data types. Anything else is a reference data type, and it stores a memory reference to the location in memory where your value actually lives. So if I create a car object, it's not true that the value of the car object, it's not true that the actual car object is stored inside the myCar variable. The myCar variable contains a memory reference that points to the place where the car is. So what that means is that in this case up here, myCar, if you were going to display the variable, points directly to the car object. In this case, car, your car, I didn't actually run a constructor. So if I didn't run the constructor, I didn't actually create a car object. So if you just declare the variable, but you don't assign an initial value, where does the memory reference point? The answer is it points to null. So that's what null is. Null doesn't just mean sort of empty or nothing. Null specifically means it's a memory reference that points to the null location. It points to nothing. But what that means is that primitive data types can't be null. So int n can't be null because null is a memory reference. And lowercase int can't store a memory reference. It can only store integers. Capital I integer, which is the object type for integers, this is a reference type. So num contains null because we didn't actually create a new object for it to point at. N contains 0 by default, but it can't contain null because null is specifically a null memory reference. Okay, last note about overloading a constructor. So here's a person class. You see 3 constructors. This constructor takes no inputs. This takes 1 input. This takes 2 inputs. That's a name and an age. It's pretty normal to overload methods and to overload constructors. It's often used when you want to allow someone to make an object with default values. So I could just pass a name, and age and number of pets both get default values of 0. Overloading a method specifically means when you have more than one method in your class where the methods have the same names, but they have different parameter lists. It's okay for when they're not constructors, it's okay for the methods to have different return types. But that's not enough for them to be overloaded. To be overloaded, they specifically need different parameter lists. So if we have overloaded constructors, when you run a constructor, the way Java knows which constructor to run is it looks and sees what's being passed. So here where I run a constructor with no inputs, it knows that matches this constructor that has an empty parameter list. If I pass a string and an int, it knows it matches this constructor with a string and an int. Well, okay, so what happens if I want to try and do this? I want a constructor where I'll pass it a name and an age, and a different constructor where I pass it a name and a number of pets. This wouldn't be allowed because imagine how we would try and use it. I might try and use it by saying Bilbo is 111 or Bilbo has one pet. But there's no way to know which of these two methods I intend to run, because in both cases it's being passed the constructors are being passed a string and an int. So there's no way to distinguish between these two use cases. So that's why it's invalid. It would be a compile time error to try and overload a method but have the parameter list be the same. Okay, that's it for this note.